Buonasera. Buonasera a tutti e benvenuti all'Accademia Americana a Roma. Siamo molto contenti di vedere tutte queste facce, ci sono anche altre facce fuori perché siete quelli fortunati che ha preso una sedia qui. And we are absolutely delighted. We have a full house and, you know, COVID or no COVID, we are back, baby. And we are so excited to invite you all here and to have you all here and to celebrate with you our new fellows of the American Academy in Rome, our Rome Prize and Italian Fellows of 2023-2024, and to welcome the newest member of the American Academy in Rome, Peter N. Miller, our new president. Peter N. Miller is one of the most widely admired and well-respected historians of antiquarianism, culture, intellectualism, and the study of study in the world. And we are so fortunate to welcome him as the new president of the American Academy in Rome. Peter received his undergraduate and master's degrees from Harvard University and earned his doctorate at the University of Cambridge. He is a scholar, an educator, an advocate, and a champion of the humanities, and he honed his craft as faculty at the University of Maryland, at College Park, the University of Chicago, and as dean of the Graduate Center at Bard College. The author of 7 books and the editor of 12 collaborative volumes, Peter has been recognized with many awards, including grants from the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation. Earlier this week, we had a griata with our staff, and our staff had the opportunity to introduce themselves to our new fellows. And it is always an incredibly touching moment for me because our staff introduce themselves. They say their own names, and they announce to our fellows how many years they have been at the American Academy in Rome. And they practice all day long. Fabio Stocchi, 22 years, right? And they're asking each other, 22, 22, 22, 22. And they practice because it is a moment in which we recognize the commitment that our staff have here to this place, to these fellows, and to the promise that the American Academy makes to artists and scholars generation after generation. We asked Peter to also stand up, say his name, and announce the number of years he had worked at the American Academy in Rome. And he stood up and said, Peter N. Miller, 2 months, 3 days, and 43 seconds. But he has already entranced us with his enthusiasm. He has already inspired us with his intellectualism. And he has already drawn us together in his vision. And I am so proud to serve under the new president, Peter N. Miller.
Thank you, Elisa. E da parte mia permettetemi di dare il benvenuto a voi, amici e colleghi romani, agli eventi di apertura dell'anno di stasera. Il vostro sostegno è importante per noi e nei prossimi anni speriamo di poter ricambiare il vostro interesse verso di noi, prestando maggiore attenzione a ciò che possiamo contribuire alla vita culturale romana e italiana. Questa serata, dopo tutto, è solo un inizio. When Brunelleschi lost the design competition in 1401 for new doors for the baptistry in Florence, where did he go? He went to Rome to draw and measure the remains of antiquity. Vasari tells us that seeing the greatness of the structures and their perfection, he was so stunned as to appear like a man out of his mind, stava astratto che pareva fuor di sé. A century later, the Netherlandish artists who came to Rome circa 1535 in the train of the Emperor Charles V, specifically Martin van Heemskerk and Hermanus Postumus, also drew and measured. They left us some of the most memorable visions of the interrelationship of art and scholarship ever produced. This is Heemskerk's drawing of ruins on the Palatine, which he captioned Roma quanta fuit ipsa ruina docet, how great Rome was, its own ruins teach, which became and remains the credo for all who study the past through things. I'm happy to call out a former fellow and trustee of the Academy, John Pinto, who published an article on the history of this epigram in 2017, and I thank another former trustee, Vincent Buonanno, for sending the article to me. Posthumus's amazing landscape with ruins, which actually depicts people like himself and Heemskerk measuring, drawing, and exploring the ruins, and which I saw in Rome in 1995 in a memorable exhibition whose images gave form to my then inchoate thoughts about time and the antiquarian, shows on the lower right what is believed to be the first depiction of Nero's Domus Aurea being explored. While the antiquaries work, they are reminded, in the manner of a memento mori, by the words of Ovid in the very center of the painting, that the same time which has destroyed the works of the men they study will menace with ruin their own efforts of recovery as well. This dialectic is, of course, one that all of us who try to preserve anything of the past are well aware of. A century later, Nikola de Perez came to Rome as a 20-year-old on a 2-year trip to Italy. Perez had convinced his father to pay for the trip by saying that he was going to study law at the University of Padua, but he seems to have spent all his time traveling around Venice, Bologna, Florence, Rome, Naples, meeting scholars, seeing sights, and exploring antiquities. In Florence, he even attended a performance of one of the first operas, Jacopo Peri and Giulio Caccini's Euridice, on October 6, 1600. Later, when he became friends with Peter Paul Rubens, they discovered with pleasure that both of them were in the room for that performance, as Rubens was himself traveling around Italy in 1600. It was in the next generation, however, that there occurred the biggest change to French travel to Rome, and eventually everybody's, with Jean-Baptiste Colbert's creation of a French academy that was to be a center for the French in Rome, but also a claim on the future. For the creation of a Rome Prize to send promising artists to live and learn in the city represented both a particular French vision of a translatio imperii, the creation of a French academy in Rome was linked to that of one in Paris, and a practical recognition that if you wanted to bring home the benefits of Rome, you would be more efficient at doing so if you housed and fed the artists you picked out to be the cultural intermediaries. The 18th century explosion of visitors to Rome, which seems to have been led by the English, became the Grand Tour, but interestingly did not lead to the establishment by the English, or anyone else for that matter, of another national academy in Rome. When Robert Adam came to Rome, there was no British academy. And when Goethe came to Rome, there was no German academy. This is an astonishing watercolor of Goethe, but for our purposes, what's significant is that it was executed by one of his flatmates in the apartment they rented on the Corso. There was no place for them. Indeed, the next academy to be founded in Rome after the French was created almost 200 years later by the Spanish in 1873, followed soon after by the Americans in 1894, but we'll come to that. In our story, the next move was made by the Germans and may take its start from a memorandum Wilhelm van Humboldt wrote in 1809, laying out the rationale for the founding of the University of Berlin. The document is well known for its place in the genealogy of the modern research university. And while university reform does make the document seem like the herald of a new age, Humboldt talks a great deal about what the older and seemingly obsolete institution of the academy could do. It is a misreading of Humboldt to identify him with an either-or. His view is that while the university will be tied more closely to the practical needs of the state, the academy, however, I quote, has only to do with pure science, understood as knowledge. The academy, he writes, is a society truly destined to subject the work of each to the judgment of all. The idea of an academy he saw as, and I quote, the highest and last sanctuary of science and the most independent corporation of the state. This is Humboldt speaking to the governors. He then turns as if to the scholars and artists themselves, and he writes, solitude and freedom are the predominant principles of an academy. But for them to work their creative magic, quote, the inner organization of these institutions must produce and maintain an uninterrupted, self-invigorating, but unforced and non-directive cooperation. He singled out as a species of the activity of the academy free oral presentations before listeners. Because among self-thinking minds, he writes, this fires those who are used to this type of study just as much as the lonely leisure of the writer's life or the loose connection of an academic one. I cannot find a direct connection between Humboldt's ideas and the next national institution that was set up in Rome, but it was set up by Germans, and it was devoted to the then newest of the humanistic disciplines, archaeology. On December 9th, 1828, chosen because it was Winckelmann's birthday. Eduard Gerhard, who had been the very first PhD awarded by that newly founded University of Berlin, proposed to the Prussian ambassador to the Holy See the creation of an Istituto di Corrispondenza Archeologica in Rome. An Archäologische Gesellschaft zu Athen had been founded in 1821, but only for Greek subjects. It is worth pointing out, however, that the Danish sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen was an early officer of this institute, and its French department was headed by the Duc de Luynes. In short, at the beginning, it was as much international as it was German. Only after 1848 was its membership restricted to Germans. Only after 1859 was its budget completely taken over by the Prussian Ministry of Education. Only in 1871 did German replace the Italian of its name, and only in 1874 was it fully nationalized and then renamed as the Kaiserlich Deutschen Archäologischen Institut. The École Française de Rome was founded the following year. Here, by the way, is a list I've compiled of the founding dates of academies and institutes in Rome. I didn't find it pre-existing in any one place, so forgive me if I've missed something significant. Archaeology emerged from philology. That same Eduard Gerhard eventually came back from Rome to Berlin to a chair in what was then called monumental philology, which alongside of classical philology and Archäologie der Kunst were new terms and were soon absorbed into and made obsolete by the still newer disciplines that crystallized by the end of the 1870s, including classics, archaeology, anthropology, and art history, and which have remained our own. Driving disciplinary change was a new concept, research. Perez may have spoken of mes recherches, and Humboldt, as well as Ludwig Wachler and Leopold von Ranke, talked about Forschung and Geschichtsforschung, but the idea of an abstract category that would shape professionalization and institutionalization did not come into existence until the middle of the 19th century. Johann Gustav Droysen, who taught at Jena and then Berlin, was the key figure. Part of Droysen's incorporation of research into historical thinking, his central phrase was researching in order to understand, forschen zu verstehen, was to give the humanities something with which to define their practice against the perceived coming dominance of the natural sciences. Our own day's crisis of the humanities has a long runway. But interestingly, it was the scientists of the next generation, such as Ernst Mach in Vienna, who were quicker to talk up research and elaborate its premises than the historians and classicists who did it and had been doing it, but who didn't theorize it and didn't see the value in theorizing it. Soon, in fact, thinking about research was identified almost completely with scientific method. For me, the clearest instance of this is that when Karl Popper's 1934 book, Der Logik der Forschung, was translated into English in 1949, it became the logic of scientific discovery. Research as the humanist's idea, as the humanist's invention, was lost to view. The rise of research as an idea and its institutionalization, both within the university and in standalone research institutes, culminates in 1930 on both sides of the Atlantic, with Abraham Flexner's establishment of an Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Flexner is second from the right as you look at it, and the man in the center with the messy hair you probably recognize. And at the same time, the publication in Hamburg of Forschungsinstitute ihre Geschichte, Organisation und Ziele. This two-volume book contains essays on the history of research from antiquity to the present, and on the different kinds of institutes that had been set up, for the most part in the 19th century, and for the most part in Germany. But it does also include a generous survey of existing research institutes around the world, including those in Japan, South America, and the United States. And it is here that we find the American Academy in Rome. In an essay entitled American Research Institutes in the Humanities, the authors state that such entities were, and I quote, virtually unknown. Where they existed at all, it was to support overseas research, and they pointed directly to the American School for Classical Studies in Athens, and here, to the American Academy in Rome. And I would note again that as with the Germans 70 years before, it was the institution in Athens that was founded first, and it was the institution in Athens that was limited in focus only to Greek matters. But the identification of the AAR with research was not merely retrospective. It's present right at the start of its history. Charles McKim, its rector spiritus, in a letter to Daniel Burnham in spring of 1894, so right at the beginning of this institution's history, described the Academy as, and I quote, a school of contact and research. A school of contact and research. Of course, American artists and writers had been coming to Rome from the very beginning of the Republic. Figures such as Rembrandt Peale, Thomas Cole, Washington Irving, Ralph Waldo Emerson, James Fenimore Cooper, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Mark Twain, and of course, the ever-present in Italy, William James, all made the pilgrimage. When the city rebelled against its overlords and established a republic in 1848-49, Margaret Fuller, who had edited Emerson's journal, The Dial, stayed on in the besieged city and reported from the front for a New York-based national newspaper in the hope of stimulating an older republic's support for a fledgling one. As many of you know, the climactic battles of the French invasion in support of authoritarianism were fought in this neighborhood and even on our grounds. And the decisive breach in the city's walls occurred in our garden, where the Casa Rustica now sits, where we will be having dinner later, which is itself atop the ruins of the late 16th century Casa Malvasia that was destroyed in the fighting. Rome's importance for the United States is obviously too vast a topic for one night. It took William Vance, for example, 2 big volumes to tell this story. And though he dedicates his epilogue to the Academy's contribution to the story of America's Rome from the years 1945 to 1985, he does not touch the Academy's role in the history of research in the United States. So as I was thinking about how to tie all this together in a nice little package for tonight's lecture, I did what we all do, especially late at night when we feel like we're running low on ideas. I turned to Google. But to give Google some help, and not to cover the same territory as Vance, I typed in the words, Thoreau's Rome. And this is the first thing I got. It's the image I had on the screen when you walked in tonight, the house at 956 Thoreau Court in Rome, Wisconsin. It looks like a pretty nice house, and it sits on a lake called, I kid you not, Camelot. But I couldn't help taking note that the real estate listing describes the Walden addition to Camelot, which goes, I think, a lot deeper into interpretation than most real estate listings. And surely Thoreau, were he here with us tonight, would have a good chuckle over this one. The next hit brought me to the New York Times of just a few years after Thoreau's death. On Saturday, April 24th, 1869, it printed an article about a visit made by its correspondent to Concord, Massachusetts, to see the sites associated with the town. The Rome of Hawthorne, Thoreau, and Emerson is how the headline writer described the place. Concord was Rome because it was a capital of culture and residence of the greats. Interestingly, Thoreau himself had made this connection in a letter of 1843, where he apostrophized Concord, which is my Rome, and its people, who are my Romans. What was Rome, the one in Italy, for Hawthorne, Emerson, and Thoreau? Hawthorne went to Rome and wrote about it. Whatever one might think of the marble faun as literature, it does demonstrate a detailed knowledge of Roman places, the city, its parks, its surrounding suburbs, and also the emotions that the city evoked. The narrator, for example, describes a feeling of ponderous remembrances, a perception of such weight and density in a bygone life, of which this spot was the center, that the present moment is pressed down or crowded out. Side by side with the massiveness of the Roman past, all matters that we handle or dream of nowadays look evanescent and visionary alike. A year after his wife died, the 30-year-old Ralph Waldo Emerson left home and went to Italy. His journal for 1833 records his encounter with Rome. Armed with Goethe's Italienische Reise, which he read in the German, Emerson threw himself into the city. On the day he arrived, he composed a poem called Written at Rome. We might treat it as a kind of type fossil of his mind, capturing what he thought of Rome before he knew it firsthand. Be great, be true, and all the Scipios, the Catos, the wise patriots of Rome shall flock to you and tarry by your side and comfort you with their high company. Hunt knowledge as the lover woos a maid, and ever in the strife of your own thoughts, obey the nobler impulse. That is Rome. A few days later, on March 29th, 1833, Emerson described a long day in the Vatican museums. Till the eye was dazzled and glutted with this triumph of the arts. Go and see it, whoever you are. It is the wealth of the civilized world. It is a contribution from all ages and nations of what is most rich and rare. He who has not seen it does not know what beautiful stones there are on the planet, and much less what exquisite art has been accomplished on their hard sides for Greek and Roman luxury. It is vain to refuse to admire. You must in spite of yourself. It is magnificent. On April 13th, he wrote, Rome fashions my dreams. All night I wander amidst statues and fountains, and last night was introduced to Lord Byron. It is a graceful termination to so much glory that Rome, now in her fallen state, should be the metropolis of the arts. Art is here a greater interest than anywhere else. And finally, on April 22nd, 1833, just before he departed, Emerson summed up his experience and its impact on him. In Rome, it is not the diameter nor the circumference of the columns, it is not the dimensions nor the materials of the temples which constitute their chief charm. It is the name of Cicero, it is the remembrance of a wise and good man, it is the remembrance of Scipio and Cato and Regulus, the influence of human character, the heroes who struggled, the patriots who fell, the wise men who thought, the men who contended worthily in their lifetime in the same trials which God, in this city and this year, is placing before each of us. He's clearly thinking about himself. This is where we can feel Emerson pulling away a bit from the gravitational field that had him in its grip this whole month. Now we see him resting free and back to his more familiar themes. Why are you dazzled, he continues, with the name of Caesar? A part as important, a soul as great, a name as dear to God as his or any other's is your own. Emerson returned to the United States via London. His essays, Nature and the American Scholar, both set forth a vision of independence from the classical world and a reorientation on a North American identity. Nature begins by asking, why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition? Why, it asks, should we grope among the dry bones of the past, or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? The sun shines today also. There is more wool and flax in the fields. There are new lands, new men, new thoughts. The American Scholar of the next year, often described as America's declaration of intellectual independence, wonders whether the time is already come when the sluggard intellect of this continent will look from under its iron lids and fill the postponed expectation of the world with something better than the exertions of mechanical skill. Our day of dependence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands, draws to a close. Reading The American Scholar, it's hard not to feel that its words echo still in these halls through the influence the essay exercised on the mind of its founders. They built an American Academy in Rome in the very image of Emerson's essay. But Emerson also warns of the power of the past, as represented in books, to seem perfect, and our forgetting that all those perfect works were produced by imperfect people. Books, he concludes, and I quote, are for nothing but to inspire. The book, the college, the school of art, the institution of any kind, stop with some past utterance of genius. This is good, say they. Let us hold by this. But no, says Emerson, they pin me down. They look backward and not forward. But genius looks forward. Man thinking must not be subdued by his instruments. To read well, he says, one must be an inventor. There is then creative reading as well as creative writing. Taking up this view of scholars as monastic recluses, Emerson defends action in the world for the sake of art and scholarship yet to be made. The true scholar grudges every opportunity of action passed by as a loss of power. It is the raw material out of which the intellect molds her splendid products. A strange process, too, this by which experience is converted into thought. The manufacture goes forward at all hours. Emerson wants to persuade us that life is our dictionary. Years are well spent in country labors, in town, in the insight into trades and manufactures, in frank intercourse with many men and women, in science, in art, to the end, the one end, of mastering in all their facts a language by which to illustrate and embody our perceptions. Life lies behind us as the quarry from whence we get tiles and copestones for the masonry of today. Colleges and books only copy the language which the field and the workyard made. When the artist has exhausted his materials, when the fancy no longer paints, when thoughts are no longer apprehended and books are a weariness, he has always the resource to live. Give me insight into today, and you may have the antique and future worlds. Hence the depth of Emerson's feelings for Goethe, whom he describes, and I quote, as the most modern of the moderns, in that he has shown us, as none ever did, the genius of the ancients. Now, Henry David Thoreau was very much Emerson's protege, but he did not go to Rome, as Emerson did, and he did not speak to the public in lectures and manifestos, as Emerson did. References to Rome are present in his writings, but they function more as mere signposts or familiar references, whether to civilization or religion or politics. They are almost never passageways into the things that matter to him, except for time. Time, whether measured by human or natural cycles. This is where Rome speaks to Thoreau. The walls that fence our fields, as well as modern Rome, and not less the Parthenon itself, are all built of ruins. Or, perhaps if I should go through Rome, it would be some spring on the Capitoline Hill I should remember the longest. Like his teacher, Emerson, Thoreau mostly has his back to Europe. Reflecting on John Brown's raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, he wrote, "I foresee the time when the painter will paint that scene no longer going to Rome for a subject. The poet will sing it, the historian record it, and with the landing of the Pilgrims and the Declaration of Independence, it will be the ornament of some future national gallery, when at least the present form of slavery shall be no more here. We shall then be at liberty to weep for Captain Brown." But even for Thoreau, Rome was never far away. When Margaret Fuller, returning from Rome to New York in 1850, was lost in a shipwreck off Fire Island, along with her Italian husband and child, here is the monument her family set up to her in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. Only her child's body was ever recovered. Emerson actually sent Thoreau to search out amidst the detritus washed up on the beach for the manuscript history of the Roman Republic of 1849 that she was bringing back with her on the boat. This was important enough for Emerson to warrant organizing a search party, and important enough for Thoreau to interrupt his life and go from Concord to Patchogue and spend 5 days combing the mournful, body-strewn strand. In fact, I think Thoreau's argument for the Americas did not so much turn its back on Rome as translate it. Take this observation about American antiquities from his journal dated March 25, 1859. They lie all over the hills. Sometime or other you would say it had rained arrowheads, for they lie all over the surface of America. Like the dragon's teeth, which bore a crop of soldiers, these bear crops of philosophers and poets, and the same seed is just as good to plant again. It is a stone fruit. Each one yields me a thought. I come nearer to the maker of it than if I found his bones. His bones would not prove any wit that wielded them, such as this work of his bones does. It is humanity inscribed on the face of the earth, not hidden away in some crypt or grave or under a pyramid. At every step I see it, and I can easily supply the Tehadawon or Nantucket that might have been written if he had had a clerk. It is no single inscription on a particular rock, but a footprint, rather a mind print, left everywhere and altogether illegible. A mind print, another one of Thoreau's magical neologisms, long before André Louis-Gourand, followed by Bruno Latour, popularized the much less elegant chaîne opératoire to describe this interrelationship between mind and making. In this same passage, Thoreau loops his story back to Rome in conclusion, though still without actually mentioning Rome. Time will soon destroy the works of famous painters and sculptors, but the Indian arrowhead will balk his efforts, and eternity will have to come to his aid. They are not fossil bones, but as it were, fossil thoughts, forever reminding me of the mind that shaped them. I would fain know that I am treading in the tracks of human game, that I am on the trail of mind, and these little reminders never fail to set me right. Thoreau, like Emerson, was committed to being present in the moment. As he put it in a poem titled, "I Seek the Present Time," Thoreau was not a great poet, just warning. I seek the present time, no other clime, life in today, not to sail another way, to Paris or to Rome, or farther still from home. What are deeds done away from home? What the best essay on the ruins of Rome? Now, that New York Times headline, "The Rome of Hawthorne, Thoreau, and Emerson," could, of course, be read another way. Not what Rome was to Hawthorne, Emerson, and Thoreau, but what Hawthorne, Emerson, and Thoreau might mean to Rome. And not the city down there, but the one up here, created by the heirs of Emerson and Thoreau on the Janiculum. As we have seen, the academies in Rome were created for artists who needed to see the sources of their art and be trained up on the best materials that there were. This was what inspired McKim, and then Morgan, Rockefeller, Walters, and the other Gilded Age founders of the Academy. Academic art crested in the 19th century. The American Academy, at its founding, may even have been its high water mark. Then institutes were created in Rome to drive research forward, once research became the goal and the journey. This vision thrived in the 20th century. What can we say about the role of this Roman institution? And maybe looking across the audience and the institutions generously represented in this room, let us say all Roman institutions in the plural in the 21st century. Yes, they may seem crushed between funding pressures and the large-scale abandonment of the humanities, especially in the Anglophone sphere, or overdetermined by an art market that knows already and better what it wants of artists. But the Rome of Emerson and Thoreau is different. They do not overvalorize the technical skills of the scholar, nor those of the artist. So why Rome, then? Here is Emerson's answer, penned, as it happens, in a letter to Margaret Fuller of June 4th, 1847. Rome is keeping its old promise to your eyes and mine. Rome, which always keeps its promise, and which, like nature, has that elasticity of application to all measures of spirit. These millennial cities, in their immense accumulations of human works, find it easy to impress the imagination by gradually dropping one piece after another of whim, blunder, and absurdity, nay, stubble and bladders, until nothing but necessity and geometry remains. So, to move towards a conclusion, what can Emerson and Thoreau teach us about what an American academy in Rome can be in the 21st century? Here are some of the things we've already heard. Do not be dazed by the past. Institutions can push us forward or hold us back. Life is the source of creativity. The present is the lens through which we view everything. Look for people thinking in what they leave behind. Seek the present time. To more easily imagine how all this could come together, I want to read a passage that is not about 21st century Roman academies, but perhaps could be. To get there, we will have to do some work together. So, I want you all to close your eyes. And if you are an artist, I want you to hear what I am about to read speaking to your world. And if you are a scholar, I want you to hear it speaking to yours. You may need to swap out some of the words and replace them with others that do more work for you. Ready? Okay, here goes. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. Let us settle ourselves and work and wedge our feet downward through the mud and slush of opinion, and prejudice and tradition, and delusion and appearance, that alluvion which covers the globe, through Paris and London, through New York and Boston and Concord, through church and state, through poetry and philosophy and religion, till we come to a hard bottom and rocks in place, which we can call reality, and say, this is, and no mistake, and then begin having a point d'appui below freshet and frost and fire, a place where you might found a wall, or a state, or set a lamppost safely, or perhaps a gauge, not a Nile-ometer, but a real-ometer, that future ages might know how deep a freshet of shams and appearances had gathered from time to time. This is what the Rome of Thoreau and Emerson could be. This is the vision that an American academy could bring to Rome, and what, refined and perfected, it could send forth from Rome in the 21st century. When Humboldt in 1809 identified freedom as the virtue of the academy, Humboldt in 1809 identified freedom as the virtue of the academy. In 1958, Isaiah Berlin, in his famous lecture and then essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, more precisely divided this into freedom from and freedom to. For Berlin, the former represented a liberal tradition from Locke and then the English, the latter Rousseau's forcing people to be free, which led through the Jacobins and on via Marx to Stalin. And yet I would say, looking through Humboldt's lens at the AAR, that it is about both. It is freedom from obligation and constraint and convention and other people's questions and time's insistent knocking. But it is also freedom to reinvent oneself and one's questions, to find new forms in which to express oneself, to make new networks and find new fields of inquiry. From its beginnings, the American Academy uniquely hosted scholars and artists. Far from being a disadvantage, in the Rome of Emerson and Thoreau, this is an advantage. Research, the systematic, recursive, question-asking for the purpose of better understanding, is something that artists and scholars share in common. Moreover, scholars can exercise their imaginative muscle by working out with artists, and artists can practice diving to greater depths by going with a scholarly partner. Both artists and scholars thrive or fail on the quality of their questions. Thoreau urges us to seek the present time, but speaking now directly to our new fellows, I want to suggest that having learned how to find it here in Rome this year, that you, and I speak also to your colleagues at other foreign academies across Rome, and then those who will follow in your footsteps next year and the year after, will be able to take this skill and seek the present time in whatever place and whatever time you later find yourselves. Back inside your institutions and communities, you will be a force for change. You will be the ones asking questions that cross boundaries. You will be the ones seeking better and better questions before pursuing narrower and more exacting answers. You will know that taking the time to listen to another mind thinking or another mind feeling is a kind of collaboration that goes beyond any kind of co-authoring. Mind prints, after all. You will know that seeking the present time is a state of mind and not place. In a way, this is exactly what McKim, the Academy's visionary founder, had in mind. In that same letter to Burnham that I quoted from earlier, he wrote, I quote, "The individual designs our scholars make are not so important as the spirit they will introduce and keep alive amongst us." And he concluded that the Academy must send men home who shall become a true leaven in America. It certainly feels appropriate that the American Academy in Rome sits atop a piece of Margaret Fuller's Rome, so that when we walk here, we are also walking in the Rome of Emerson and Thoreau. The role of an American Academy in Rome in the 21st century is precisely to use the many-layered richness of this city, its physical depths of time, but also its layers of interesting people and complex institutions, to help leverage us out of the ways in which we have been trained to think and perform, to cut through the mud and slush of opinion and find that hard bottom below freshet and frost and fire. Much as I admire what Emerson was seeking in 1837, the quest to find or make an American scholar is long past. The future needs a different kind of scholar who will be the one asking the questions no one else asks, bringing together the creative people who wouldn't be brought together otherwise, for the purpose of exploring territories from perspectives no one else can see. And we have our model for this right here, because it was from right here in Bass Garden, where we will soon be having dinner, from the very same Casa Malvasia destroyed by the French in June 1849, that Galileo, on April 14, 1611, gave a small number of Romans a chance to look through his telescope for the first time and see the future in the present. They could not have imagined all that would follow from that night. 400-odd years later, a Rome of new Emersons and new Thoreaus is clear enough to envision. It is the task, it is the special challenge of an American Academy in Rome to help us get there. Thank you very much.
We're going to take some questions from the audience now. We have the microphone here so that people in the cryptoporticus can also hear us.
So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll pass you the microphone.
Thank you so much for an absolutely wonderful and inspiring talk. It was fantastic. Spread all this, all the figures you brought in, and all the ideas. Sorry. Oh, right. Right, good. So that hopefully works this time. So thank you for such a wonderful vision of what academies in Rome can do. I speak from someone who used to be at the British Academy. But I thought the whole thing was magnificent, but one little thing stuck in my mind and thought, is that a problem? Which was your division between scholars and artists. So that I just wondered, well, that split we heard about with Karl Popper, on putting science on one side, and then that leaves the humanities on the other side, and therefore behind. I just wonder if you can think of people who have achieved wonderful things relatively recently, not going back too far in the past, who have achieved wonderful things as scholars and wonderful things as artists, sculptors, architects, or whatever, filmmaker. So, can you think of anyone?
Well, I'll answer the question. I can think of many people. In fact, to speak just to that part of your question, I would say that one of the most interesting phenomena of the contemporary art world is precisely the interest in research-based art, artistic research. There are many terms for this. Historically speaking, a lot of this was launched by the Bologna process that rewarded art schools with additional money for giving PhDs because PhD became the criterion for funding. So there's some make work in all of this, but I would say of the last 25 years or so, there are extraordinary examples of artists doing research, and not just doing research as preparatory work, but finding ways to show the research as the art. And I myself believe wholeheartedly that artists and scholars share much more than they don't share in terms of the intellectual work involved, even if the expressions take different forms, and even if the guidance in the end may be different because of the greater licitness of feeling and emotion, obviously for artists than for scholars. The reason I made the distinction at all is because if you look at the history of institutions, that kind of list I typed up of academies in Rome, what is clear is precisely a division between academies which were for artists and institutes which were for scholars. And that's a division that emerges right away and persists until basically our own time. So it wasn't so much me saying this is a norm that we should honor, on the contrary, but rather just observing that this seems to have structured the foundation of these institutions in Rome, suggesting that in the world that provided the resources for founding those institutions, they believed that they were separate communities. It's interesting that in the history of this institution, from early on, though not originally intentionally, the scholars and the artists were jammed together.
I have a question. Whoa, sorry. I have a question from Zoom. It is from Barbette Beth, who says, I worry that in not being dazzled by the past, we lose what it can teach us. The American Academy swallowed the American School of Classical Studies at Rome in the early 20th century. Since then, the study of ancient Rome at the Academy has gradually been replaced, or at least demoted, by other more modern and hence relevant interests. What do you think should be the role of classical studies at the American Academy in Rome?
So I think there was a great adjective. I'm a big fan of newspaper weather maps. I have a little book that I wrote that's coming out soon about them. And one of the interesting things about weather maps, aside from the visuality, which we could talk about, after a suitable number of glasses of wine, is if you pay attention to the adjectives used in weather reports, they are fascinating. So swallowed up, I think was actually kind of a merger of equals more than a swallowed up, but we could discuss that on Zoom. I would say actually that like a logarithmic table, I think the view of the last century has been crushed to emphasize the present a little too much. Classics, I would prefer to say the study of the ancient world, was a dominant expression of the past study at the academy until very late in the 20th century. And even if you want to talk about the introduction of art history or post-classical humanistic studies, the art history was really the history of the reception of the ancient world in art. So actually, through most of the 20th century, the ancient world did reign supreme in terms of the lens through which questions involving pastness were engaged at the academy. And that's great. And I hope that in the future we can build up the role of the study of the ancient world at the academy. We have a long history behind us of commitment to these fields, and as the current caretaker of the institution, one of my principles is to build on the past, not to abandon the past. But in exactly the same way, and I did a book project about this 20 years ago, in exactly the same way that it was, in fact, the study of the ancient world that gave birth to all the modern human sciences, archaeology, anthropology, art history, history of religion, even sociology. I mean, that fact, which is something which we can study from, let's say, the 1840s through 1900, that tells us something, that there is a kind of fecundity to the study of the ancient world that directly has led to the flowering of different ways of studying not only the ancient world, but the contemporary world. And I think we should be inspired by the power of the study of the past, the way it has functioned in this way as a spur to develop new techniques for studying the world around us. And it would be terrific, I think, and a fulfillment of the commitment of the founders of this institution to the study of the ancient world if we continued in the 21st century to build on that past, to study the world around us and the world that is coming in the newer ways that are available.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture, Peter. And I'm just going to ask a question because you tapped into one of the great debates in modern history, almost tangentially. But when you said there's a straight line from Rousseau to the Jacobins to Marx to Stalin, do you want to say a little bit more about that? Because that's a strong statement.
I mean, this is Berlin's Two Concepts of Liberty. And I hope that all of you will go out and read it. I'm sure there's a PDF online you can get on your phones while you're having a drink upstairs, which is a great essay. And, I happen to have been inspired by Berlin when I was younger. I'm not sure as a professional historian of philosophy, which I became, that I would find it today as precise and nuanced as the kind of academic renderings of these things that we might view as more of, academic standard today. But there's a power of presentation that's worth thinking about. Some of you are splitters, some of you are lumpers. Berlin was a lumper, for better and for worse, clarifies some things, obscures others. I think his main point, though, is, and that was really why I brought it in, he is nervous, writing after the Second World War, about the idea of forcing people to do what's good for them, because he lived through the consequences. And that is a worthwhile caution for all of us to be aware of. At the same time, thinking and transposing, as I was doing in the lecture, transposing this question of what is freedom or liberty to the world that we are creating here, and I didn't use the word in the lecture, but I'm very comfortable using it, and I will use it now, and that is, transposing it to the vision of utopia that we are creating here. I think it would be false to that vision to say only negative liberty, only freedom from, because there is something in our experiment, and all utopias have a little bit of tub thumping to them that makes me nervous about utopias, but yet nevertheless this was created as utopia, and we have to own it. So part of the utopian aspect of this place is saying, eat together, talk together, walk together, drink together, it's good for you. And I wanted just to introduce that because speaking to the fellows in our audience, I wanted to provide something to think about, that these are not, what we do here is not idle, it's not thoughtless, and it even has a philosophical pedigree, which I welcome you to disagree with if you want to.
Hi. Peter, thanks for your answers. And I actually had this question, so you sort of beat me to it. And I want to tie together some of your answers about the world and the production of knowledge. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your vision of the role of the academy in producing knowledge about the world and the knowledge it produces. What the responsibility of the academy is in the knowledge that it produces to meet the challenges of the world we see today.
So I've thought a lot about that question in the 2 weeks, 3 days, and however many hours I've been president. And the reason why I wanted to talk the way I did tonight is because I would say for now, it's very clear that the academy is not here to produce research outputs. It's not a place that has as its task or responsibility from some government or quasi-governmental funding mandate to produce X quanta of books or lectures. We are fortunate in not having that. And so I thought about, well, what do we produce? And I would say what we have and what we do currently produce are people, right? But we don't, we are a kind of downstream institution, by which I mean, people come to us from wherever else they are in real life. And so we don't produce them, but what we can try and do is make this detour life-changing. And of course, some aspect of the life-changing has to do with how beautiful the grounds are, how well maintained, how wonderful the staff is, how much they care about providing ways of making your work opportunities here more and more successful. But when I thought even more about it, what I felt was that this kind of image of Emerson and Thoreau actually might be the kind of goal that we could aim for. That's to say, producing a kind of cohort or cadre of people with that kind of a free view of life, where the work, the scholarly work, it's not either or, right? That's not the goal of this. It's to produce more interesting scholarly work, better art. And then for those people, you here, to be able to stay like that and encourage others through your interactions with them by example to be like that also. So I would answer your question to say that what we produce now at our best is a vision of what a scholarly or artistic life could be. Having said that, I do think that there are things in the future that we could do here that would actually also, but in a different way, build on the institution's history to do things for our understanding of the present and the future that aren't done in other places. So I think, in fact, the very complicated, or let's say distinctive, fact of the combination of artists and scholars together here can actually be to the greatest advantage of not just the institution and not just those artists and scholars themselves, but even to the wider community if all of this can be harnessed and geared effectively.
A question from Zoom. Linda Duke asks, I wonder if you find any value in the term aesthetic research, meaning research that investigates ambiguity and collisions of seeming contradictions in ways that creates new complexities rather than reductive verdicts.
I mean, the short answer would be yes, of course. I spend a lot of time reading Heidegger, and Heidegger talks all the time about his phenomenological researches, by which he is using the term research to describe a structured process of systematic question asking and perfecting in a kind of hermeneutical way the quality of one's questions and therefore the quality of one's answers. Seems to me aesthetics is a perfectly legitimate domain to do that, as well as many other domains.
Thanks. I was wondering if we could reapproach the question of the legacy of classical studies here, maybe from a different angle. And I know that this would be an answer in progress given the 2 months and 43 seconds, but I'm curious about how you think those of us who are working in and on Rome and on Greek and Roman in particular pasts can do so without replicating narratives that are in service of ideologies of Western cultural superiority, and what you might see as the role of the academy and fellows in that.
So, I would say that my own approach to the study of the ancient world is a very broad one that looks very far back in time and wide and moves much closer towards the present than many conventional endpoints of the ancient world. So that's the first thing. I really believe in a bigger world and a more capacious one. That wasn't really so much in tonight's lecture, but every generation asks its own questions. Just as A.B. Warburg said, every generation gets the renaissance of antiquity that it deserves. So we always ask our own questions. Our own questions are affected by some combination of who we are, if we can abstract that into some kind of essence, and the world around us that we interact with and selectively respond to. So in a way, one doesn't have to worry, because if one is in a present that is strongly decolonial, it's less likely that the questions one asks will be strongly colonial, just because it becomes impossible to do those things as one lives in that time. I also think that we ask so many different kinds of questions now that our questions are different from the questions asked by scholars 100 years ago, or even 60 or 70 years ago. And then I would say also that I actually don't believe that disciplines can be completely corrupted. Disciplines are not evil. People may be evil. People may put knowledge to ill use. They may manipulate knowledge. I mean, one of the things that interests me is bad research. Is bad research that is done badly, or is bad research good research that is put to bad ends? All of that is possible. So I'm somebody who doesn't believe in tossing out disciplines because we don't like the politics of people who did them some time ago in the past. If anything, it becomes more of a challenge to study those periods, those places, those people with different kinds of questions and explore different facets. In the end, we who study the past do it because we are fascinated by something about the humans who lived then that we don't understand and want to understand. So in that sense, we are tied to those people who come before us. But from the scholarly side, we want to know more. And so we always are trying to surpass, to be more acute, sometimes to be judgmental where our predecessors were not. Sometimes to ask the questions that our predecessors were blind to. And that's part of the process. So I actually think that as challenging as some of these questions can be to young scholars in the field, turned around, we also live in a time that is much more open to different kinds of questions than maybe any scholarly moment since the founding of the modern research university.
Another question from Zoom from Paul Arpaia. I am curious if you have any thoughts you could share about the role or roles you envision for the cooperation between members of the Society of Fellows with the communities of annual Rome Prize Fellows and the AAR in general.
Well, I think one of the strengths of the institution, and indeed it's a strength of any institution that has a long history, is the flourishing of its alumni, whether it's a university or an academy in Rome. And I think that the alumni constitute an enormous resource, an enormous fund of intelligence, knowledge, collaborative power. And I think all the opportunities that we can develop and take advantage of to bring fellows together, to bring fellows into the ongoing life of the academy, whether it's here in Rome or in the United States, all to the good. So I'm all in favor of that. I would say, though, that when the question was starting to be asked, I thought the question would be asked about how to bring members of the different academies and institutes in Rome into closer contact, which I think is it. Excellent. Thank you, Caroline. So, I think that is a crucial question. One of the things that excites me about having the opportunity to lead this institution is the recognition that Rome is one of the most wonderful cosmopolitan cultural cities that I know of. And though these national academies and institutes kind of travel below most people's radar, they actually represent an opportunity to do work together at a much higher level with a much more variegated range of questions, precisely because of the different places, literally, from which people come. And it would be great to organize closer collaboration. And, sometimes, at least I believe, that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Doing things sometimes in a more local or small-scale piloted way can often achieve bigger results than very complex, elaborate architectures of knowledge and collaboration. So I hope, that we can start even on bilateral levels doing more to take advantage of the enormous wealth of talent and curiosity that the academies represent.
From Rachel Warren, thank you, President Miller, for the great content provided. In my study of the ancient world, specifically works of the art sculpture masters, as an artist, I have learned how to ask and answer the questions that no one else has asked or answered, as you suggest. What studies of the ancient world will you promote as president of the AAR?
I'm just glad I'm not running for office. I already have it. Well, as somebody who spent the last 20-odd years of my life running a graduate research institute devoted to studying the past through things, I think there's an enormous opportunity in Rome, of all places, for an approach through the lens of material culture to link together archaeology, history, literature, and the arts, all of the arts. And I think that's something that we could think of doing in a much more systematic way. We have and have had a deep commitment to art history and archaeology here at the Academy. And it would be great to not only continue that, but to use that as a way of connecting the study of the ancient world to the very contemporary interests of many of our scholars and artists who come here, who themselves, because of what they do, work with material. And that's a kind of uniting bond which we should take advantage of. It's not an artificial construct. On the contrary, it's something that is very much part of the working warp and woof of all of our fellows.
Final question from Zoom from Daniela Williams. And this, I think, is appropriate for you, President Miller. How are your research interests going to be shaped by your new position as president?
So that's a very good question. When I first became dean at the Bard Graduate Center and first started to think of it, which it hadn't thought of itself as until then, as a research institute, as a graduate research institute, that was when I started looking into the history of other research institutes. First, I called my friends, then I looked for reading material. That's how I came across that German volume of 1930, which is called Research Institute. So that was an early find in the library. And so it was the case that my day job became a prompt for my night work. And I think my interest in research and the ways scholars and artists research together and differently, something which I've started a few years ago, is something that not only will continue here, but will be really advanced by the opportunities I will have to spend time looking and talking to the artists and the scholars who are here. But the thing that I want to emphasize, and I'll just wrap up with this in a kind of Thoreauvian vein, is that when you do something like this and you open yourself to something like this, you don't know what will happen. So I can't really answer the question of how this place will shape my research until after that research happens and after I'm no longer at the American Academy in Rome. And that's, I hope, very far in the future. So I'm not going to even try and anticipate that.
Thank you very much for being such an attentive and inspired audience. As you can tell, we have chosen well, as the Knights of Templar said to Indiana Jones, right? So you have also chosen well by being here with us tonight, because upstairs we have an elegant, beautiful, wonderful evening of surprises for you. And if you will join us in the cortile, we will have an aperitivo, live jazz, and the opportunity to speak directly with our new president, Peter N. Miller. And please help me. If you are a fellow, a new fellow of the American Academy in Rome, please stand and be recognized. If you were a fellow or a resident of the American Academy in Rome, please stand and be recognized. And if you already have a drink upstairs, please stand and go up the stairs. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was a marathon.